I have a first round of questions, which is a sort of opening statement to the three of you. And the question is, in what ways do gender dynamics and intersectionality manifest in your respective fields? I'd love it if we could start with Ariane, followed by Keenan, and then Dorothy. Ariane, please go ahead.
Thank you, Damian, and thanks for inviting me to speak here. It's such a pleasure to be at this event with all of you and with you as my co-panelists as well. So as you rightfully already stated, our field of work is the prevention of and countering of violent extremism. And at Violence Prevention Network, analyze extremist movements, and we also build programs and policy advice to counter them. Our work informed by the direct work perpetrators as well as their families on our analysis of these extremist groups when we look at anti-gender movements and
Sorry, we're having it's cutting off the video a little bit. Is it possible that I think your internet might not be super good at the moment. Could you maybe have your camera off?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Maybe it's better.
And do let me know if there's another issue. I can try a hotspot.
Will do. Okay, so far seems good. Please go ahead.
All right, great. So in our area of preventing and countering violent extremism, over the past years, I think it has become abundantly clear that there are links between violent extremism and anti-feminist actors and ideas, that misogyny and sexist ideas are the basis of both of these phenomena and also a strong basis to violent extremism itself. And this is becoming more and more visible and well-researched. We see that anti-feminism and misogyny play a key role, both on the organizational and ideological level within extremist groups, but also in the functioning itself of these groups. We see that across different types of extremism, extremists are connected by strong patriarchal beliefs in traditional gender roles, in the superiority of men, inferiority of and we see militarized forms of masculinity that are being promoted. Of course, these are connected to traditionalist, heteronormative, cis concepts of gender and also of family and sexuality itself. And creating strict rules around these, policing them and adhering to these is a very core functioning of how extremist groups create in-group identity, form ideologies, and work with them. Violent extremist groups at their very core base their identity and ideology on the notion of superiority and inequality. And of course, the us versus them of knowing the uncompromising right way and of the in-group of the extremist group being superior to any other group is, so to say, in the DNA of extremist thinking. And knowing that sexism is one of the first types of unequal thinking that we learn, and that is so naturalized in our thinking, of course, this is something that extremist groups are very well able to latch onto. Upholding and controlling these norms really contributes to strengthening the group itself, and also contributes to a very important mechanism in radicalization, which is separating them from any other ideology, from any other outgroup. Apart from the role within the functioning of the groups itself, extremist groups use anti-gender and anti-feminist narratives to build ideological alliances across different types of extremism, something that we're very worried about. These organizations, and apart from the ones that we see across different forms of extremism, we also see them being able to mobilize around these topics, something that you, Damian, have alluded to. to more conservative areas of the society, to actors that would not usually be associated with extremist thinking or extremist groups at all. This is why in our area it's often referred to as symbolic glue or bridge ideologies that are able to connect and latch onto extremist groups themselves, but also other parts of society. And of course, this is something that we're very worried about with regard to their ability of mobilizing on that and getting in touch with new target groups. And our common understanding of what extremism is, both when we think about right-wing extremism, but also, for instance, Islamist extremism or other fundamental religious extremism, see that the very core idea of sexism and misogyny and anti-feminism is not really part of that understanding yet. This is, I think, an issue, and it's also something that we're increasingly worried about, because we do see these ideologies manifest themselves very directly in recent terrorist attacks across the spectrum. And we see that, for instance, when we think about Christchurch, Halle or Hanau, we see anti-feminist thinking very strongly reflected in right-wing attacks. We also see attacks that are directly targeted at the LGBTQI community from actors that we would traditionally call Islamist extremist actors, such as the attack on the Pulse nightclub in the US, which at the time was the deadliest attack in the history of the US. But we also see direct misogynist extremism and terrorism perpetrated by actors such as the so-called incel, involuntary celibate community. So yeah, all in all, both as practitioners and researchers, we're very concerned about these interlinkages and believe that this is where we need to look if we want to effectively address violence and going. If we want to build meaningful responses that actually match the threat that we're seeing.
Thank you very much, Ariana, for showing us where the interlinkages lie, especially in terms of the organizational and ideological level in the functioning of these groups, but also to pointing at the use of these anti-feminist and anti-gender ideologies in forming these ideological alliances, not just with other extremist groups, but also across the kind of spectrum or further to the, well, not further to the left exactly, but like with other conservative movements and groupings of people, and very much the same thing that allows the anti-gender movement to remain as unified as it is, being the symbolic glue of this non-signifier or empty signifier of gender, is the exact same mechanism that then can be used to form much broader alliances for anti-rights, anti-equality, and perpetrating actual violence in various contexts. Thank you very much for that. Keenan, I'd love it if you could reflect in what ways gender dynamics and intersectionality manifest in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much for the floor, Damian. First off, to say that I work for ILGA Europe, the European region of the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Alliance. We are a regional network of more than 600 LGBTI organizations across 54 countries in Europe and Central Asia. And I'm part of our team working on policy and advocacy within our broader organization. I think this is an interesting question because it sort of gets at the root of the way that I think about our opposition when talking about anti-gender and anti-trans movements, because the frame of reference for the world it appears that they're trying to create is one that is intentionally and inherently anti-intersectional, if we can say it that way. I think it's really important for us to see sort of the anti-gender actors as a component tool of a much broader agenda and as an entry point for that broader agenda that impacts many more of us than just women or just LGBTI people or just sexual and reproductive health and rights, because the target ultimately isn't about keeping trans people from being able to access legal gender recognition. It's about what that represents in terms of the undermining of the human rights framework, right? So if a trans person isn't able to get legal gender recognition, that's a removal of the protection of the right to individual autonomy, the right to bodily integrity, the right to self-determination, the right to recognition before the law, the right to the highest attainable standard of healthcare, and all of those rights being undermined and dismantled for individual population groups ultimately leads to all of those rights being undermined and dismantled for everyone, because the international human rights framework only functions as a universal set of rights and protections, and the states are responsible for ensuring that everyone has equal access to those rights and protections. So as we start to see them eroded for individuals or individual groups, that isn't really about those individuals' rights. It's about attacking and undermining the framework that should protect those individuals and everybody else. And when we see it from that frame of reference, then the question becomes why? What's the target? Because we can say the target is undermining the human rights framework, but that actually isn't a reason. The human rights framework is a document. Who cares? But what could be the reasons for wanting to see that framework undermined? Well, when we look at who, as much of your work and other organizations have pointed out, when we look at who is funding these things and who is resourcing and helping to coordinate these things, it becomes clear that it's about money. It's about capitalism, power centralization, and those who have money being able to maintain access to that money. And the human rights framework undermines capitalism. The human rights framework and capitalism are, to a degree, really incompatible with one another, because capitalism functions on the exploitation of labor, on the exploitation of individuals, their time, their bodies, and the exploitation of very specific issues like the capacity to become pregnant for people who are assigned female at birth. That exploitation leads into the power that capitalism has, and we can't disaggregate these pieces and look at only the targets of individual attacks and understand the larger framework. And I think it's much more important for us in trying to fight against these efforts to see them as what they are part of, rather than see them as individual problems at individual country levels or in individual contexts. And so a big part of our work at ILGA Europe has been about trying to bring different LGBTI actors, different trans actors, as well as other allied organizations into the same conversations. Because one of the things that our opposition wants us to believe is that what's happening in our country is unique. That's what's happening to us is only happening to us. And it's not like what's happening in the next country over or in another continent or region. And we are harmed by that because we get myopically focused on the things that we're seeing in our country and how to respond to them. And that the opposition is able to radically shift and react because they are resourced and interconnected in a way that we are not. And so building up our interconnectivity allows us to be able to react to their shifting strategies and shifting tactics in a much more thorough way. But to sort of rotate around in the other part of your question about the relevance of an intersectional framework to this work, I think what is at the link to the first part of what I said here and that question is that the tactic of trying to shave off the most marginalized or the most opposed groups of our society is one that can only be combated by ensuring that those people are at the center of the process of the response, and that their needs and their vulnerabilities are the center of our conversation. So it's vital that trans people, particularly trans migrants, trans women of color, trans people who are engaged in sex work, are engaged in these spaces and talking about how the anti-gender actors and their tactics are impacting them, because without the voices of trans people in the conversation, the tactics that are eroding the edges continue to erode the edges without assuming that trans people have expertise, not just on their own lives, but on what's happening in a global context, means that when we get shaved off as trans people, when we get shaved off the human rights framework, the framework collapses for everybody, but nobody noticed until it's too late. And so there's a need to shift whose voices are part of our conversations and to ensure that those that are most marginalized in general are likely the ones most exposed to this as a as a risk, and thus need to really be at the center of our analysis, our resourcing, and our conversations about the issue. I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Keenan. That was brilliantly put, and I very much can only echo the need to center the experiences of those who are being the first target, but they're not the only target, and those who actually understand and feel on a daily basis what these attacks look like in order to be able to develop a response. Because like you said, also, all of this is about money and power is money, and we don't necessarily have the money on our side, but we do have unity as an option and the ability to speak to each other and learn from each other and operate and not just get try not to be myopic in terms of the country context, but also try not to be myopic in terms of the silos in which we're used to working on, because we absolutely have to interconnect all of these issues in order to effectively be able to respond and be part of the same conversations, because we don't have the capacity to be everywhere. But if we talk to each other and about these things, we might be able to actually cover everything. And finally, Dorothy, I would be really happy to hear from you how gender dynamics and intersectionality manifest in your work.
Thank you very much, Damian, and thank you, our previous speakers. To me, according to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, these rights are supposed to be universal, regardless of who one is, what they believe in, or what they are, etc. I am an environmental activist, I'm a women's rights activist, and I'm a vulnerable groups rights activist. But during my work, I encounter a lot of anti-gender, anti-feminist actors and their ideas, which make me wonder if human rights are really universal, or they are discriminative and are only supposed to be or to occur for some groups of people, and others are not supposed to enjoy them. There is this argument that we encounter mostly in our work, that gender equality already exists. In most cases during my activism work, the anti-gender actors pretend not to understand our demands. They keep on telling us that the gender equality has already been reached, but it's a big lie. Not when women and LGBTQIs are minimally represented in decision-making. A clear example is that COP26 decision-making was dominated by men, even when the Gender Action Plan, which was passed at COP23, it was really not working. It just remained on paper. So I don't see us reaching the gender equality as they always say in their arguments. Another thing is the diversion from the real point. During the Ugandan general elections, for example, being the director of a Green Party in Uganda, I managed to accompany our candidates to rallies, political rallies. But when a man stands up to speak, he is asked a question, what will he do for the constituency? But when a woman stands up to speak, her time is wasted being asked about the way they addressed, how it is not traditional enough. And they also, they were asked, are you married? And if they said they were married, they would be told, now how are you going to manage your own marriage and the constituency work at the same time? And if they said they were not married at all, it didn't also save them. They would tell them, if you really cannot manage a marriage, then how do you expect to manage a constituency? So these women leave these political areas very, very depressed and very discouraged. It makes it very difficult for these women to engage and compete for leadership positions on fair grounds. Is that really gender equality? As for LGBTQ, no chance in my country. Sometime back, a man was decampaigned in elections because he was suspected to be gay or even supporting homosexuals since he was an activist. And he was heavily decampaigned in the constituency because the electorate, or even those people who call themselves concerned citizens, thought he would spoil their children. So I wonder if these rights are really universal in Uganda. These ideas really impact negatively on my work and our work as activists in Uganda. We do get shut up sometimes and get discouraged. I myself have been attacked on many occasions. There is a time when I participated in the gender aggregated data workshop organized by Forum for Women in Democracy. And at lunchtime, this man asked me to serve him food. It is lunchtime and it's supposed to be self-service, and he tells me to serve him food. I tell him, no, I cannot do that because I don't have much time. I'm preparing for my next session. And he's telling me, you are a woman and this is a work for women. And I told him, no, this is not work for women. And then he tells me straight in my face, that's why you're not married. With your silly feminist talk, you spoil our. So this was supposed to make me feel so ashamed and to make me feel small. So we really get those things, but we just keep on trying to explain to these people, but it's not so easy. I don't know. Uganda is a signatory to the convention on elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, but I don't know why it doesn't put it in reality. So this anti-feminist, anti-gender people really are impacting negatively on our goal as gender activists, and we need to find ways to counter this. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Dorothy, for sharing that. And I can only sit and be impressed by your continued willingness to engage with these topics in a space that is continuously shrinking and where there's active efforts to, like, for all the rest of us, right, the active efforts to disengage us from the work that we're doing and to remove whatever space we have carved out for advocacy and activism. And I'm also grateful to you for highlighting one of the main narratives of the anti-gender movement in a lot of countries and a lot of contexts, which is that gender equality, has already been achieved and we already have all of these rights. So what more do you want? Why do you still talk about these issues? These are non-issues, ignoring the fact that even if we have, and it's a question of how much we actually have papers written and signed and passed and ratified in Parliament protecting these rights, what that means for the lived experiences of people is not always directly translated. And we can't allow the, taking of laurels and patting themselves on the back for those actors who do say that we have all of these rights, but are not actually doing anything to implement them or are actively trying to hinder them. In the second round of the questions, I would like to zoom in on the three themes that we're exploring today. And I would love to start with Keenan. And Keenan, for you, the question is, anti-gender campaigns and anti-trans campaigns rely on the use of fear-based narratives and vagueness and disinformation, especially online. In a world divided into echo chambers, how can we reach broader audiences with our narratives of inclusivity and the need for intersectionality?
Thanks very much, Damian, for that question. You've clearly articulated in the question that a piece of the tactic is intentional dis and misinformation, and I'd like to add a piece to that I think is an important part of what the tactic looks like, which is posing questions without seeking solutions, without seeking answers, trying to get people to ask, as Dorothy was just mentioning with respect to LGBTI issues in Uganda, about what are the consequences for our children. I'm afraid that there are risks in XYZ field, and in those conversations, there's no interest in the research or data that investigate those questions, the target is to get the question planted, and to use that planted question to seed doubt and division among the general populace, but also to seed doubt in policymakers. And so for us, one of the pieces of the response that I think is critical is for everyone who is on the sides of human rights to work to educate ourselves to be able to respond to those doubt seeding questions or doubt seeding efforts, because there are answers, and allowing the question to hang unanswered is part of our technical problem in dealing with anti-gender movements. They get the question into the media, they get the question into parliaments, and when we or our allies don't have the answer at hand, then the question is the only thing that stays on record, and the question is the only thing that the general public sees, and then the general public starts to think, maybe that is a good question. What are the consequences for our ability to collect gender equality data if we allow people to self-determine their gender marker on their IDs? What are the consequences in terms of the potential for fraud or for whatever? And that question gets deep-seated, and it's much harder to unroot when we don't have the answers, and when our allies don't have the answers. And so what does this mean with respect to how we engage audiences in a more inclusive narrative? What it means is that we, as sort of all actors working in favor of protecting the human rights framework, need to be prepared to stand in true solidarity with one another. We need to be able to respond to the questions, to call them out as bad faith questions, to acknowledge that the underpinning assumptions of those questions are bad faith from the beginning, and that takes risk from us as human rights defenders, and not just on our own topics. And I think this is the piece that I really would like to see us figure out how to do better in the human rights sort of civil society space, is be prepared to take risks for other groups than just our own target groups, because each of those attacks on an individual group, be it our own or someone else's, ultimately impacts the framework that we're trying to protect and to work within. And so we can't allow any of those attacks to go unaddressed. One of the things that we have done at ILGA Europe in collaboration with trans-led NGOs is develop resources that help activists and policymakers respond to anti-trans misinformation. And in this effort, the target is to get NGOs that are not working on trans or LGBTI issues at all, and policymakers into a place where they can recognize bad faith arguments and respond to them or call them out as bad faith in the moment. Because we won't change popular opinion with our slow, nuanced responses when our opposition is constantly able to produce sound bites and quick and catchy slogans. We have to be prepared for those quick and catchy slogans and know our nuance well enough to tease out at least that the slogan is in bad faith. And that, as I mentioned before, means we have to be willing to take our own risk for bringing the onslaught of negative attention that comes from anti-gender actors onto us, as well as seeing it hit its general targets. The last piece I want to say on this is that I think part of that risk we have to be willing to take is extremely personal. One of the things we know about trans acceptance is that knowing a trans person is what leads people who are originally anti-trans into a more trans positive position. Not everyone that knows a trans person or has a trans relative moves into that place, but knowing us changes the conversation. However, there are not really that many of us. And we need people to be willing to challenge their uncle and their dad and their brother-in-law at the dinner table, to be willing to challenge their coworkers at work, and protect the rights of people who aren't in the room in our conversations, because the broader shift as in cultural climate and in general society's beliefs is a collective responsibility, and one where all of us have to be prepared and willing to take those personal risks that people who are on the margins are confronted with without choice every day.
Thank you very much for that. And once again, the call for true solidarity and being able to, I think what you were saying points out not just why we have to, why is it so important that we engage in countering the narratives of the anti-gender actors, whilst also building our own visions of the world, so that we can't do one or the other, that we have to do both, because not engaging is just not an option that we have. Because once these things make it into the mainstream ecosystem of ideas, these sound bites, however much in bad faith they might be, they're there and we have to work with them. So this is what we need to address and sort of target the, so to speak, movable middle with it a little bit. And now, Dorothy, I'd be really grateful if you could reflect on your work in Uganda and beyond. What is your experience with efforts to impede the ability of civil society and rights advocates to receive funding, assemble in public, and take influence on the multilateral and local levels? And how would you say is this challenge compounded when bringing a gender dimension into your activism and work?
Thank you very much, Damian. Like you said, all these years I've been working as a climate change campaigner, and I have struggled for climate justice and gender equality, because as you may be aware, climate crisis and gender inequality are interrelated, but everything is just low. And yet the impacts of climate crisis are already affecting especially vulnerable people and women. And of course, we cannot work without funding, but it's also not easy to get funding. First of all, because our movement may be very small in our own countries. Secondly, because even the government itself doesn't give us the space. We really talk to these, we try to bring to the attention of policymakers the need for gender equality, the need to let CSOs work, but it is next to impossible with the level at which CSOs space is shrinking in Uganda. So, for example, our government sees NGOs as a threat. They see civil society members that are increasingly being accused of being political opposition or foreign powers to destabilize the government, which is not true. And when it comes to climate justice, we ask government to balance the number of accredited international conference attendees like COP, but still they send in more men than women. And as for LGBTQ, like I said, no chance. It is even, it is even illegal in our country. The forests are being cleared for sugarcane plantains, and remember, some forests have indigenous people living in them. But when this happens, they are displaced and they suffer terribly. But when civil societies try to fight for them, we are being stopped, we are being intimidated, and sometimes arrested. We have been currently fighting against Bugoma forest giveaway for sugarcane plantations in Uganda, in Western Uganda. We tried demonstrating against it, but some of our fellow activists and environmental journalists were arrested. And this is really scares our civil society. Some NGOs in Uganda were banned at the beginning of this year. Government wanted to check what they really do. They check how much money you receive. And it's too much. Government is really insecure if it's a lot of money coming to your accounts as an NGO. It is really terrible. in Uganda, and we are so scared. The space is shrinking so fast. For gender and feminism work that I do, the society also looks at us as enemies sometimes, and this was with LGBTQ. They use disinformation, harassment to scare away people. I'm sorry, I give a lot of examples because this is what I do every day. I was once invited to attend and facilitate a workshop in Uganda on the health rights of LGBTQs, because they also have to have health rights. They're also human. But the workshop didn't even end because we were chased away by police. But even during this, before they chased us, we had watched a documentary, and there was this boy who was being recorded before he died. He was taken to a hospital, a national hospital in Kampala, but his relatives ran away from him, blaming him for doing this to himself. And what do you expect if your relatives run away from you? Do you expect the nurse to really care about you the way they would care for someone who is being loved by the relatives? So this person was denied the right to health, the right to medication, and he later died. So I really wonder if they really believe that everyone has a right to health, like they say it. I want to really report that in Uganda and the global South, especially in Africa, with our traditions, civil society space has been really restricted. Yes, the question is by who, but it's mostly by government in our country, and also the male-dominated society, our country being so, and the conservative societies too. The government checks on everything, including funds received and activities. The arrests and closure of NGOs in my country. According to Human Rights Watch, just recently, in August on 20th, Ugandan authorities announced without prior notification the closure of 54 civil society groups, and this included human rights and election monitoring organization. Uganda's constitution guarantees freedom of right of association, but these latest steps that they are doing now only compound Uganda government is already troubling restrictions on civic space. So we really need to fight so that we don't even lose the little we have attained. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dorothy, for your reflections and your experiences. I pay particular attention to kind of the banning and the auditing and of civil society organizations and the designation of them as political opposition or foreign actors, which means in a restricted space, a lot of civil society, especially in repressive regimes, does not have any access to domestic funding, but also loses access to foreign funding and international funding, which makes it almost impossible for civil society to operate. Pairing that with arrests and harassment makes it literally impossible in a lot of cases to operate. And these chilling measures, at the very least, institute a self-censorship of civil society on what issues they can speak out on. And I think this and the example that you gave of the boy who sadly died in hospital is, if the right to health is not universal to everyone, then none of the rights are universal to anyone. And this links very nicely with what Keenan was talking about before, when they said that we have to stand in solidarity and talk about each other's issues, and we have to create the space where the space is being taken away, and we can only do that by linking together. Ariane, if you could tell us how we've talked about how violence perpetrated on the basis of anti-gender and anti-feminist ideologies is growing globally and becoming much more radical. I know from previous conversations that we've had that you see gaps in this area. How should this issue be addressed, both on the civil society level and the policy level?
Thank you, Damian. And I'll counterintuitively, I'll switch off my camera while talking just to make sure you can hear me. So I think I'll give a couple of points that I think are worth engaging with in our area of work, knowing that a lot of you are already working on these points. So a lot of this will sound familiar, I think, to many of you here in the digital room. But I think in preventing and countering violent extremism, one of the things that we have to realize in this is that anti-feminist and misogynist violence is representative violence that is aimed against individuals who represent a changing, modern, non-binary gender norm. And this violence and these ideas are at their very base not compatible with the idea of democracy, because they do not grant equality to all of these groups. I think the first step in doing so in the sector would be to recognize and take anti-feminism and sexism very seriously as ideologies that are part of violent extremism, and understand how massively they overlap with other forms of inequality and other forms of discrimination. Because it's, of course, representative violence, we need a more intersectional analysis, but we also need to understand that when we see right-wing actors mobilizing around conspiracy theories such as the Great Replacement, which coincidentally was also the title of the so-called Manifest of the Christchurch attacker, for instance, we need to understand that this is an overlap of different forms of different ideologies in the sector, and that we need, on a very broad scale, to educate practitioners, policymakers, and researchers about what that means in terms of and in terms of also approaching our target group, because as I said, we work with these target groups directly. We also, I think, need to find stronger indicators of including this in our work. I already alluded to in my previous statement to the fact that we understand violent extremism and extremist narratives around the different types of ideologies of inequality, but sexism and anti-feminism is not so much one of them. Yet, on the other hand, we've seen some upcoming research looking at attitudes in some Asian countries and the MENA region that supports the claim the support of misogyny might actually be a stronger indicator of the support of violent extremism than the indicators that we traditionally look at in our sector, such as age, sex, and social factors. So I think there's this really the lack of knowledge regarding how deeply entrenched these ideologies are within violent extremist groups, and also how we should address them. Another link is to be made by looking at the intersections of different forms of violence that stem from this. So there's some research strong linkage of individuals who have perpetrated shootings and extremist violence. And this is something too that I think in practice is often underestimated as a warning sign and as a factor in addressing violent extremism. And of course, we have to, and this is really groundwork, I think that the sector of preventing and countering violent extremism still has to do, which is really gender mainstreaming PCVE work, because the programs that we build and the policies that we make continue to be aimed around traditional ideas of cis men and women. The programs are mostly geared towards a militarized idea of masculinity. And I think this leads to the fact that on the one hand, we still systematically underestimate the active roles that women play in these movements. But also it leads to the fact that there's a lack of services to actually support them when they want to get out of these movements. And then maybe two brief other points to touch upon in terms of what I think we can and should do is to support CSO engagement in preventing and countering violent extremism, which is a sector that is so securitized and very much framed around the securitized notions of what we should and can do. And I believe that CSO engagement and especially supporting women and queer-led organizations to do work in this space is really something that would greatly benefit to our responses in this area. And lastly, and this also latches on to what Dorothy is saying, connecting these different areas and making sure that we don't work in silos and that we can we can exchange expertise across these different sectors.
Thank you very much, Ariana. I think we are running slightly behind schedule, but we have about 7 minutes left. So I would but thank you specifically for pointing at the representative nature of the violence perpetrated on the basis of these ideologies, and specifically for linking it to what you said at the beginning in terms of misogyny being one of the very first form of exclusion and inequality that we tend to learn as we're socialized. And then once that remains unchallenged, how it can lead to the acceptance of all other forms of inequality and exclusion, and how we can kind of grow into potentially radicalized situations. So for the third round, and you've all touched upon this in different ways in your input so far, but I would ask you all to reflect a little bit on sort of the very systemic frame of the question that we're addressing. So given the growing anti-democratic tendencies globally, the decline in freedom and the shrinking space for civil society to act, which, as Dorothy mentioned, takes place in the global south, but very much also in the global north, looking at recent reports by the European Parliament and the European Fundamental Rights Agency, paired with the increasing transnational organization of the anti-gender movement, seeking to reestablish the dominance of racist, capitalist, patriarchal structures. How can we better work together to respond? We know that we need to, and most of you have mentioned certain ways how, but maybe in a couple of minutes to wrap up, what are the most important points of the collaboration and how can we better do it? I'd love it if we could start with Dorothy, followed by Ariana, and then Keenan at the end. Dorothy, please go ahead.
Thank you very much again, Damian. And I'll go straight to the point, and I would say create awareness. For the people who are already knowledgeable about this, like CFFP, you're doing a very good work, so we should also do the same, create awareness to build internal capacity, if I can borrow from the CFFP's Power Over Rights Report recommendations. This way we shall not get the same people who we are fighting for, siding with the oppressors and thinking we are the enemies, which happens sometimes. The other main point for me is intersectionality understanding. It is very crucial in this fight, like Shannon has been saying. It is better to understand that we all have unique ways of discrimination happening to us. Some people get double or even triple discrimination. You're all aware of that. Therefore, as you fight for women's rights, try also to fight for environmental rights. Join other groups like the eco-feminists, the LGBTQIs, because somehow these groups are interconnected and have one common enemy, the human rights abusers, the anti-democratic actors, etc. The other point would be to bridge the gap between people who are fighting for the same cause, even if they're not the same. In the beginning, Steiners mentioned about the divisions among the human rights defenders themselves. So I would say we should bridge that gap so we can fight together, not divided at all. For example, there are some people who are human rights defenders, but they're not LGBTQs. It doesn't mean that they're not together in this. They may not be that, that's not the way they feel, but they feel that LGBTQs have the right. And there are some who are men, but they want to fight for the rights for women. We should be together in this. And we should also bridge the gap between the feminists who are white and those LGBTQs who are colored, because they get double or triple, even triple discrimination. Then I'm also not ashamed to talk about funding. Civil society needs funding more than ever. Nothing can really be done or operated without money. We need money for mobilization. We need money for meetings, refreshments, hiring venues, facilitators, transport. We therefore argue international organization to fund our activities whenever we are. I know I talked about government checking our accounts, but it also depends if you really know how to play it, like account for it, and making sure you haven't broken any law, then you can use those funds. It shouldn't discourage people from funding people from the global south. I like the Center for Feminist Foreign Policies widen and strengthen alliances. Seriously, if feminist groups from the global north do not work together with other people, it will be a lost war. People from the global north, people from elsewhere, people from the global south should partner together as groups who are fighting for the same cause, because it will really strengthen me if I know that there's some people who I'm working with elsewhere. Yes, it will widen the space for CSOs. We shall be more strengthened. But if we are on our own and we are harassed, we shall be more vulnerable. So please join and support other groups. Then I conclude by saying that it starts with you here. You, the people who are here, go out there and spread the news. Stop the lies. Tell people about what is really happening. Yes, the misinformation should be stopped. We need to fight even harder. We are together in this. So we should therefore work and fight together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dorothy. That was wonderful. And nobody should ever be ashamed to talk about funding. We need to unapologetically demand that funding structures be changed so that we can work, and ideally we can live from the work that we're doing, because it is crucial. Ariane, please, your wrap-up reflection.
Thanks, Damian. So maybe two main points. Of course, the first point is working across sector. I've already spoken a little bit about this. One example would be linking the actors and researchers working on women, peace and security, and preventing and countering violent extremism. I think these agendas and policy agendas overlap quite a lot, but are working very, very much in separation, I think, still. And this is also true for the support systems that come with it. So support systems for women who became victims of sexual violence, gender-based violence, I think would be good actors to partner up with in our field as well. But I think more importantly, it's about building alliances and working together. And this is really a question of how. I believe that we should emphasize the long-term nature of forming alliances and structured partnerships more. Because what happens a lot of the time, from what I'm seeing, is we get together once or twice. There's no actual relationship built between the people, although the work might overlap or there might be agreement on many topics. I think structural partnerships and alliances take time to develop, and this takes several meetings. This takes investment in working groups, in working together on shared topics that we find important. And we just must recognize that this takes time and yes, funding too, and a dedicated effort to do. I don't think that this is possible just on the side of our normal jobs. So I think this is one thing. And then the second thing, and this very much goes hand in hand with something that Keenan said, is that we have to recognize that countering sexism, anti-feminism, and anti-LGBTQI sentiments in the broader society is prevention and countering of violent extremism as well. And this is a task for everyone. And this is more of an everyday task, I think, that we can all contribute to with our families, our uncles, and everyone we meet. This is a very broad last point, but I do believe that it's an important.
Thanks, Ariane. And yeah, I very much, I don't know, the boldest letters in the world on the kind of the need for the long-term nature of the alliances that we would like to form, and we're advocating this especially to donors who don't seem to understand the need for structural long-term partnerships and how much time and effort and money it takes to build these alliances. So like we can't keep funding single-issue projects. We can't keep funding single-year projects. We need to engage long-term and sustainably in order to work effectively. Keenan, if you would like to bring us home for the end of the panel discussion.
Thanks very much. I'll be very brief because Ariane and Dorothy have made most of the points I want to make, so I'm just going to add two. The first of them is, while anti-gender, anti-rights movements work in a way that is both highly interconnected and resourced enough to be highly situationally situated or contextually situated in the places where they're implementing campaigns, tactics, whatever. And our response must be equally resourced to allow for high-level contextualization. A phrase that works or resonates with a person in Russia speaking Russian will not necessarily work with a person speaking Russian in Ukraine or in Belarus. Similarly, a phrase or an idea that works in Spain in Spanish will not work the same in Argentina or Bolivia or Mexico. And so we can't treat a highly contextualized opponent with broad strokes, global, centralized efforts that do not have the resources to implement at the local level. And so that's a clear donor and funding call that, it's very useful to coordinate and to create spaces for efforts that bring voices together to try to parallel the anti-gender movement's structures, but we also need the resources to implement at the local level with local context, which means salaries and overhead costs for local activists to engage both vertically and horizontally in this process. And the other thing that I would say is something that I have been seeing as a trans activist over the last 5 years that I would love to see us figure out how to change is that the cries and calls that something is a problem, a serious problem, often go unheeded for a long time when the marginalized group is one that people don't relate to, can't empathize with, and we need to flip that on its head. When highly marginalized groups say this is a problem, we should all be freaking out. Because the moment that something scares those who already are highly vulnerable and on the front lines, all of us should be terrified by the fact that trans people, that sex workers, that Black women are afraid. All of us should be terrified of that, and not the other way around. We have centered cis, white, heterosexual voices in these analyses, particularly in academia, for so long that those people are not convinced something is a problem, then it isn't a problem. And that can't be the way that we function in this response. We have to flip that completely on its head. And if the marginalized group says it's a problem, nobody needs to be convinced. We're all convinced because the marginalized group, this is my cat, says that it's a problem. That for me feels like a fundamental change that would radically improve our ability to react and respond to anti-gender actors. Clive says hello.
Thank you. Hello, Clive. And it just made me miss my cat that I had to put in another room so that he wouldn't jump on the desk while I was facilitating this panel. Thank you for that. I was nodding so much that my neck started to hurt, because the point that you made is I think, really important, that we need to decenter the white cishet narrative and listen to those who know best what's going on, and who already, if they're afraid, that we need to be afraid, that the most marginalized. And it's extremely important to kind of figure out that what is at stake is democracy. What is at stake is human rights as a concept. What it leads to is real life violence and real life suffering, especially for those who are already politically marginalized and not taken into, whose opinions and lives are not taken into account by those who create politics and policy. That it leads to repression, it leads to self-censorship, and the erosion of what little space civil society and activism manages to carve out for itself. And that what we need, I think, as a kind of summary to this entire panel discussion, for which I thank you all, it was excellent, is solidarity and collaboration across sectors beyond the traditional defenders of gender and sexuality rights, because that's not the only thing, that is not what is actually at stake here. Sure, it might be the first thing to be attacked, but it is not what we're actually fighting for. What we're fighting for is the right to assemble, the right to associate, the right to have a say in how our societies are being governed, and the universality of human rights as a concept, because without that, none of the rest of it makes any sense or has any point. And to the issues of funding, I think the other day I looked at Avid's update of their 2013 finding that, you know, the median budget of a women's rights organization or a feminist organization globally was about 20,000 euros. $20,000, and in 2018-19 that number had increased to potentially 30,000, which barely accounts for inflation. And I think that that's the 48% of feminist civil society in the global south operates with about a budget between $0 and $30,000. And looking at sort of lesbian, bisexual, trans, and queer women's organizing, the global median budget of that is about $11,000, and this is unacceptable, and this cannot work, because, like Keenan was saying, we can have all of these like global narratives about everything, and that's all very helpful and good, but we need space and the funding to act locally, and funding has to reach grassroots movements. And that's why all of these also governments who, speaking about laurels and you know, window dressing, who talk about having, you know, the EU has about 60% of its ODA, overseas development assistance, being allocated to gender equality as a significant objective, but only 5% of it is with gender equality as a principal objective. And even that talks about, you know, inclusion of women and girls in all of those like non-terms. And 99% of official development assistance never reaches feminist and queer grassroots organizing. And this is what prevents us from acting. I have stolen about 3 minutes of the break just getting engaged into the panel, but I would be, I'm very, very grateful to all three of you for speaking. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here. I would suggest that we all go into the break for about 5 or 6 minutes, then maybe come back and we will prepare the breakout rooms in the meantime. And when everybody is back, the participants will be able to select the breakout room that they would like to attend. The breakout room 1 will be focusing on the issue of disinformation, breakout room 2 on the issue of violent extremism, and room 3 on civil society space, where we will talk about what these terms make us feel and what we can do about it. I'd ask everyone during the break to please think of a couple of notions, ideas, or phrases that come to mind about the topic that you would select for the breakout room. Thank you again to the panelists, and see you all in a few minutes.